All right. Well, welcome everybody to this webinar. Thank you very much Robs, for your introduction. Um, we'll be characterizing complex systems and their properties in this event and exploring some modeling approaches and techniques that are frequently used to study them. Um, great. So what are complex systems for a start? I have a few questions that have been up that you may have had a chance to read through to sort of get us going. And I'm just going to read through these. And I think I'd like you to think a little bit about not necessarily how to answer these questions, but how these questions are like. What are underlying similarities between the subjects that these questions are addressing? So how do ecosystems sustain themselves and evolve? Why does biodiversity tend to increase with ecological succession? What processes allow ants to organize and act collectively as a single intelligent and self-sustaining unit? And maybe a human example, how do microeconomic interactions between economic agents give rise to the global economy? So all of these questions are questions about systems that we would consider complex systems. And we'll go into a more in-depth definition a little bit later on in this presentation, but for now, I just want to define complex systems as systems that are composed of many interacting parts, in which the local interaction between the parts results in global phenomena which we call emergent. Another way of saying this is that complex systems exhibit what's called a gestalt, or more than the sum of the parts behavior. This is a visual organizational map of complex systems from a textbook by Sayama, which kind of gives you an idea of the topics, the subfields that are typically contained within the complex systems umbrella. You can see this is quite a broad umbrella. There are various pretty large subfields like pattern formation, evolution and adaptation, systems theory, a lot of scaling theory and networks. And this is a rapidly emerging and maturing field, which has which is very sort of fun. I would say it's fundamentally interdisciplinary in some ways. And if we look at real world systems, many real world systems happen to be complex systems. So I'd like to consider a few examples with you and how we might study them with some computational examples. I'd like to just note that there are many ways that we might choose to study any given complex system, and that in this presentation, we obviously can't show all of the different ways that we might study complex systems because it's just such a large, broad field. And also, uh, an additional thing I'd like to note is just that for any given system, we'll always have to make some simplifying assumptions in order to model the system in a way that's tractable. So a first example might be flocking type behaviors. If you consider flocking birds or migrating grazers or schooling fish, what do all of these systems have in common? Well, in all of these cases, we have individuals that are interacting, and where the local interactions of the individuals results in the emergence of a more global, large-scale dynamic behavior. And these larger scale emergent phenomena are are uh, they're persistent through time, and they can organize into various states depending on the behavior of their members. So, in the case of birds, that's the flock. In the case of the herd, the grazers, that's the herd, and in the case of the fish, that would be the school of fish. And and so these are large scale behaviors that are hard to reduce to the individual interactions um, between the components of the system. I'd like to just note that Giorgio Parisi, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2021 for his work on complex systems, discusses murmurations of Starlings specifically in his book that was published earlier in July last year, In a Flight of Starlings. A lot of complex systems self-organize, and when they self-organize, some of them self-organize towards critical states where small perturbations will result in event cascades, which we can call avalanches. And these cascades can have large consequences that spread throughout the system. When a system organizes towards critical states, by itself, we say that it exhibits self-organized criticality, or SOC. And one property of complex systems, systems that exhibit self-organized criticality, is that the distributions of avalanche magnitudes and durations in these systems follow power laws. So I'd like you to take a moment to spot the intruder in these four pictures. Um, this is going to be the first poll. Which of the following phenomena is not hypothesized to result from self-organized criticality? Is it forest fires? Is it earthquakes? Is it avalanches? Or is it processes in the human brain? And if you're following this, if you've downloaded the handout and you're following it on the handout, you may have had a chance to skip ahead and see the answer. In which case, it's all right. We'll give you a pass this time. Okay, so we have a fairly I would say we're leaning towards human brain activity, but we have a fairly even split between forest fires and earthquakes as well. And it turns out that this was a bit of a trick question. In fact, all of these, except for snow avalanches, are hypothesized to result from self-organized criticality. Um, Self-organized criticality is hypothesized to explain the power law distribution of earthquake magnitudes. This is something that we see, for instance, in when we're modeling earthquakes, but also when we look at the frequency distribution, the frequency magnitude distribution of earthquakes, we see that they follow a power law distribution, and that's hypothesized by models like the Olami-Feder-Christensen model to be the result of self-organized criticality. But also the power law distributions of neuronal avalanches, um, according to an increasingly popular hypothesis called the critical brain hypothesis, is also hypothesized to be the result of self-organized criticality. Though we don't, the jury is still out on all of these, whether self-organized criticality is really found in these systems in nature. Though it seems to be a very it seems to be a powerful explanatory mechanism. So snow avalanches in nature are the only ones that we know, based on their behavior, really likely don't result from self-organized criticality. So I'd like to give you a bit of a computational example so that we can narrow down and clarify what we mean by self-organized criticality. So the first discovered model of self-organized criticality is the abelian sandpile model, also known as the Bachtung-Wiesenfeld model. And this is a cellular automaton which typically will be demonstrated on a rectangular grid. So how this works is you have a grid with a bunch of cells, and each cell holds sand grains, and each cell can hold at most 3 sand grains and remain stable. And if there are more than 3 grains of sand on a particular cell, then that cell is unstable and it topples. And as it topples, it loses 4 grains of sand, and those grains get distributed to the cells on each of its sides. So at the top, at the bottom, and left and right cells in the von Neumann neighborhood. So we can look at what happens in this sort of system when we drop, for example, 100 grains in one place and let it topple until it's stable. So here I'm looking at just one cell, and I've set it so that as the cells topple, the grid is going to expand, so we're going to see more and more of the space. So here we're looking at one cell, and now we're looking at 3 cells. And now if I keep it playing, we'll see as things topple, they accumulate on the outsides, and they keep toppling, they accumulate, and this interesting structure is emerging from the result. So already there's this sort of this pattern that's emerging from the behavior of the system, but we haven't seen self-organized criticality yet. We've seen self-organization, but we haven't seen the criticality part of this model yet. So as we add sand grains in this column, we've increased the instability of the sand pile, and so the toppling, we've triggered this toppling that will continue until the sand pile reaches what we call a minimally stable configuration. And in this case, the minimally stable configuration has some interesting properties. So it has some symmetry. It has multiple kinds of symmetry, and And we can ask the question, well, what happens if we had dropped a much larger number of grains? What happens if we drop 10,000 grains? I'm not going to show you the animation in this case because it takes a bit more time and power to compute. But this is what you end up with. You get this. And so now you're probably noticing that this has a fractal structure. There's some self-similarity on top of the symmetries going on. And this is quite remarkable, right? Why would this sort of this this interesting self-similar pattern appear from such a simple dynamical process? Still, though, we haven't reached the criticality part of this experiment. So what does self-organized criticality look like in this model? Well, this is in the original paper by Pabak and colleagues, self-organized criticality and an explanation of the 1 over F noise, published in 1987. This is the question, the fundamental, the core question of the paper that they explore, and they propose a process for exploring self-organized criticality using this model. So you start with an array in which each cell is assigned a number of grains a little above 3, and then you let it topple to its minimally stable state. And that minimally stable state will be a critical state. And then you drop a grain of sand anywhere on this sand pile, and you observe the resulting avalanche. And you can repeat this over and over again. And the idea is that by doing this in sequence, you'll ensure that your result is a critical state. So if we do the first 2 steps of this, we'll get this. This is just one of the outputs that you might get, given that we're starting from a random array. And you'll notice that the black cells here, which corresponds to 0 sand grains, are all by themselves. Then there's never another. There's very, very rarely 2 of them adjacent to one another in the von Neumann sense. There's never one to the top, one to the bottom, one to the left or right. So we have this state of the sandpile model, which looks quite random, and this is, you'll just have to trust me that this is a critical state. So now we're going to drop a sand grain on the sand pile, and in this case, I'm just dropping it in the center, and look at what happens. So suddenly we have lots and lots of activity, and as time goes, that activity is going to get constrained to a smaller and smaller area. And at the start, it's taking almost all the space that we have in our grid. But as it goes, and I'm going to just accelerate a little bit, as it goes, it's going to get smaller and a little bit finer, and then eventually it's lots and lots of smaller avalanches that are sort of separate from one another, that are all cascading until they reach a new state, which is now a new critical point, a new critical state of the system. And again, you can notice that in the interim here, in these unstable states, there are lots of these 0 cells that are adjacent to other 0 cells. There are more of those cases, and whereas in this final state, typically you won't find 0 cells adjacent to other 0 cells. So in this case, it took a while for the sand pile to stabilize, and as I said, the stabilized sand pile is another critical sand pile. And if we iterated this process over and over again, and we kept toppling until we stabilized to a new critical state, adding a random grain somewhere, and then toppling until we reach a critical state, and took the frequency distribution of avalanche sizes, we'd get a power law. And what this tells us is that there's no characteristic avalanche size in this system. The scale, the sizes of avalanches produced by this system is there's no sensible way of saying that there's an average size to them. There's no sensibly defined mean, and that's a property that you see in any system that follows a power law distribution in some of its state variables. So here's another example that was maybe grounded a little bit more in real world systems. The forest fire model is one of the other very popular models that's used to demonstrate self-organized criticality, and it's interesting because it also captures some real world properties of forest fires. Again, this is another cellular automaton. This is a probabilistic cellular automaton. So there are some stochastic processes involved. Um, and how it works is you have this grid in which things can either be non-flammable or flammable stuff like trees, or stuff that's already been burnt. That's also, so then the stuff that's non-flammable, but that is non-flammable as a result of having been burnt. That maybe something can grow in it. So trees may grow in we'll call that wasteland. And then things that are currently burning, which we're just going to call fire in this case. And this is how we're coloring them for this particular demonstration. So how it works is that if a tree is on fire, it burns down at the next time step and it will leave wasteland. Trees that are adjacent to at least one already burning tree will catch fire. Trees will catch fire independently with some probability, and this is you can think of this as like a lightning strike, for example. And once a fire has raged through a landscape and burnt everything down, trees grow in wasteland cells with some probability of a tree growing, P of T. So here's a very simple visualization in 2 dimensions where the probability of new trees and the probability of new fires is set to 0. So we're just seeing the burning process to give you a quick a sense of how fires propagate in this system. So here we have a little bit of water, we have some trees, and we have one fire. And at the next time step, it propagates to its neighbors and leaves some wasteland. And then at the next time step, that propagates again to its neighbors and leaves some wasteland. And again, it propagates and leaves some wasteland. So you can see how the fire then propagates in this sort of this outward way. So here I've got a little landscape that I've made up with some rivers in it and some clusters of trees. This is a fairly dense forest. The overall the only real separation between clusters is the rivers. And I've started a fire. It's difficult to see here at the first time step, but there's one starting here and one starting right here. And if I let this run, we'll see the fires spread and burn everything that is in its path in a continuous cluster of trees. So in this model, I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is that the scale of a forest fire is dependent on the scale of the clusters that the clusters of trees that the forest fires start in. And in what's been demonstrated about this model is that the model will exhibit self-organized criticality when the probability of new trees growing is much larger than the probability of new fires starting. And this is applicable in the real world. In the real world, you have trees have time to grow into large clusters, and these clusters can form roughly at any scale, while fires sort of burn through them and separate different clusters. And there are obviously other processes in the real world that separate trees into small and larger clusters at different scales. But what happens is that if you have a giant cluster of trees and a fire starts in that cluster, it's much likelier to burn a much burn much further and produce a much larger fire than if you had a more clustered a clustered landscape with smaller clusters of trees. And this is what informs this is the rationale behind a lot of modern wildfire management policies. And the reason why we do controlled burns, it's to partition the landscape and just to stop fires from spreading continuously over very, very large areas. So in this particular model, self-organized criticality will occur, as I said, when you have a much larger probability of new trees growing than a probability of new fires starting. So here's an example. The ratio starts to be meaningful usually like when it's about 100 times difference. So compute 200 steps of simulation with some random fires starting in random places at a 1 in 1,000 probability at each turn. And so we'll have a few starting fires, and then we have this transient behavior, and then we have these fires that are continuously starting, and these clusters that are continuously clusters of trees that are continuously growing. Obviously, in the real world, fires don't spread quite as. In the real world, we'd have to for this to be much more meaningful, we'd have to pick a much uh, smaller rate of new fires, but it makes for a slightly less interesting visualization, I think. Um, but what you'll notice again in this system is that if we were to take the scale of tree clusters or the scale of forest fires, um, and if you were to take a distribution of fires by their size and either by their magnitude in space or their duration through time, you would get a power law. You would get a power distribution. So power laws are very frequent in complex systems, and self-organized criticality is one explanatory mechanism for the emergence of power laws. But I should clarify that there are other processes that can result in power laws in complex systems, and in fact, many complex systems that we think are very unlikely to exhibit self-organized criticality do, in fact, like present power law, like scale-free behavior. So, power laws and other fat-tailed distributions can suggest the influence of complex processes, um, but they're not the be all end all. They're not the final explanation. You have to sort of you have to look into this further. And observing power laws in nature is not necessarily an indication that self-organized criticality is at play. It's not enough on its own to indicate complexity. So complex systems come in many sizes, and we often find them assembled into layered hierarchical modular structures. The components in these structures at each level are separated by constraints that act as membranes between them and their surroundings. This is the case in biological systems, in ecosystems, and as we'll see also in Earth systems. In biological systems, we find layered hierarchical modular structures, um, for example, in multicellular organisms, where cells assemble to form tissues, and tissues form organs, and organs assemble into organ systems, and organ systems assemble into whole organisms, and so forth, and so on and so forth. If you take then at a larger scale, you might be looking at an ecosystem, for example. Um, and in all of these situations, the levels of organization are produced by some hierarchical assembly. So hierarchy is built into complex systems, into these modular assemblages. And each level, if you take a level of this hierarchy by itself, it conveys on its own the rules to some extent of the whole organism. Um, so going up a level in this sense is sort of going from cells to tissues or tissues to organs. You can understand an organism entirely to some extent from its cells taken as a whole. You can take or you could look at its tissues organized as a whole, you could look at its organs organized as a whole to understand the whole system. So this implies that when we're going up a level, we're actually projecting many states onto fewer states. So you could think, for example, when you describe the state of a heart at a given time, um, you could describe the state of a heart at a given time with the states and interactions of every one of its cells, but you don't have to do that. And the reason that you don't have to do that is that at higher levels, fewer states are needed to represent the overall function and the behavior of the heart. So we can use this principle in fact when we're modeling complex biological processes like immune system response to vaccination mathematically. And this is the next example that I'm going to demonstrate. So this is an example from a preprint by Zhu and colleagues from 2023. The preprint is a mathematical model simulating the adaptive immune response, in various vaccines and vaccination strategies. And the reason I'm bringing this up is the reason I'm demonstrating this model is because it's a very convenient way of showing what kind of information is needed to model a complex system. When we're approaching a complex system and we want to model it, what we need, the main things that we need are the components. We need to be able to say what are the parts of the system, how do these parts interact, what are the interactions, and what are the parameters that affect that affect the behavior of these interactions. And and if we have all of this information, in principle, we can express this as a set of differential equations. And then there may be additional questions about whether that system will be numerically stable and whether it's tractable, whether it's whether it has a closed form solution, etc., etc. But in principle, you can write it down. So in this case, I've written down a set of, I'm using Robert Nakbar's compartmental modeling packlet, and I've written down a set of reactions. So we have all of these reactions between different components in the immune system, and we have, so this would be one component, this would be another component, and this would be the interaction parameter. Then I have a data set specifying the actual parameters, what they are, what their values will be for a particular simulation. And then I have my state variables defined. So I know what are the actual components of the system. And using the compartmental modeling packlet, you can simply ask for a graph that represents all of these interactions visually. So you can say, okay, okay, there's this part and it's interacting with this part, with this parameter, etc., etc. And you can see the system as a whole and get some idea of, what are the parts that are going to be that are going to have most feedback with other parts, etc. And this is a helpful visual summary. We can also use the packlet to generate a set of differential equations to describe the system. So I don't have to write this all by hand. I can just say, okay, I've defined all of my variables, my interactions, just tell me what this is going to look like as a set of differential equations. And in this case, I have added a little bit. I've said that at the time step, at the 50th time, at when time is equal to 50, I'm going to set the mRNA to a new value to simulate a second dose of an mRNA vaccine. And the first dose, if I go, the first dose is here at the 0th time. We have a first dose. So we have, so we can then use ND-solve and feed it our system of differential equations and the names of our variables, and just ask it for a simulation from t equals 0 to t equals 100, and get the result. And that'll be our solution. And then we evaluate that and change and substitute the we evaluate this result in a plot, and we can get a visual representation of the behavior of all of these variables over time as resolved by Wolfram language's numerical differential equation solver. So I want to talk a little bit about, I want to get back to this idea of hierarchical modularity. So an ecosystem is a system that's composed of biological communities of interacting organisms in their physical environment. Ecosystems form large networks of interactions that contain subnetworks with high recirculation of resources and signals. And so at a microscopic scale, these subnetworks might be cells in an organism. They might be an organism as a whole. And at a larger scale, these might be niches or communities. And niches result from the emergence of patterns of recirculation of resources and signals in ecosystems. We also find that ecosystems assemble in these modular hierarchies. So we'll find that, and this is a simplification, obviously, because we can't necessarily draw clear borders between ecosystems, but there's a sense in which, in a statistical sense, this is the case, and the sum total of this nested hierarchy of ecosystems is what we call the biosphere. So we have the biosphere is composed of many ecosystems, which themselves are composed of many smaller ecosystems, etc., and so on. And so again, note the hierarchical layered modular structure of these systems. And we can use the insights from this modular hierarchy in our modeling again. So for instance, uh, if we were to model the interactions between um, several species, some of which are predators and some of which are prey to one another, how would based on the information that I've given so far, how might one do it? What information might one need to do the to um, I guess this is the next poll question. So suppose given n species in a food web, what information might one need to define a continuous model for the evolution of these populations over time? And we'll wait for a few answers to come in. Okay, it seems like we have a strong preference for the second answer, and that's the answer in the case of the model that I'm exploring in this following demonstration is yes. Well, we would need to define the instantaneous effects of species interactions on each species pair. So we would have to know how does each species affect another, um, and and what are the parameters that control these interactions. So this is essentially the insight behind the generalized Lotka-Volterra model. The generalized Lotka-Volterra model is a model of population dynamics given a web of relationships between interacting species in an ecosystem. And typically the way you would specify this is you specify the interactions as a matrix, where every row, the ith row and jth column represents the average effect of the the effect of the average species J individual on species I's population growth rate. So for example, in this example here, if you say this is species X, species Y, species Z, species X, species Y, species Z, then sorry, just want to make sure, this value here would be the effect of species Y on the average individual of species Z whenever an individual interacts with another. So we can represent these interactions as a graph, as a weighted graph, and we can say, okay, well, these are the species, and these are the effects that they have on one another. And this is just another convenient way of visually getting a sense of what's going on. And you could make any graph like this to represent any set number of interactions between any number of species. And with very high numbers of species, you might get a system that is not numerically stable. So we can't be confident of the robustness of the results if we were to simulate it numerically. But in principle, if you can express these relationships as a matrix and you can express the number of species and the ways that they interact, you can write this out as a set of differential equations. So you can simulate this. So we can use this function that I've defined, generalized Lotka-Volterra ODEs. This is defined at the end of the notebook, for a given set of initial parameters to simulate this system. You'll need a list of variable names, an initial list of population sizes for each species, a list of the intrinsic growth rates for these different species, and this interaction matrix that describes the community interactions. So this is an example of what it would look like, setting it up. You say, okay, well, these are species X, Y, and Z. This is the initial sizes of the populations. These are their intrinsic growth rates, and this is their interaction matrix. And it will return a set of differential equations that describes the system with the differential equations and the initial conditions. And again, we can use the built-in numerical differential equation solver and dsolve. We feed it our system of differential equations and our variables and tell it we want to solve over this time range. And it returns a set of solutions a set of interpolating functions that give us our solutions for the system of differential equations. And then we can just put that in a plot function and evaluate it over that particular time range, and we can get a visualization of the evolution over time of this particular system. So here we can see that there's this fairly stable oscillatory motion between the three different species that follow each other quite closely. And we could look at this in 3 dimensions in a state space portrait, where each of these axes is the different the size of the individual populations of species at a given time. And as we go down this line, we're going forward in time. And we can see there's initial evidence in this plot that the attractor in this particular case is a limit cycle. So it's going to approach this, it's going to start cycling towards the end of this. If we let it run further and further, it wouldn't expand forever. It would get constrained in this outer ring. Okay, so the biosphere itself is a component of even larger complex systems. For example, we can look at the entire Earth as some complex system, and we can call that the Earth system. And we can sort of simplistically break this down into a network of interactions between big components like the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the geosphere, and the biosphere all together. And so we might want to study these we're at the stage where we're looking at massive amounts of real world data. And so while we do have many models to simulate these real world systems, like weather forecasting models, etc., in all of these cases, it's very tempting a lot of the time to just look at real world data and see if we can apply some statistical models to understand them better. So in the Wolfram language, there are many ways to access information about real-world systems, and these are a few of the functions that you can use to do so. So you can get financial data, information about cities, countries, plants, species, volcanoes, weather forecast information, the impact craters of meteorites and various other objects from space. Or in the case of the demonstration I'm about to show you, we can get earthquake data. So here, in this case, I'm saying I'd like to retrieve data for recorded earthquakes between 2000 and 2023 with Richter magnitudes between 6 and 10. So I've got this table that contains all of this information, and I'm not going to recompute this because it's going to take a little while. But you can see that we have 3,387 observations of individual earthquakes. And so I might say, okay, well, where were all of these earthquakes? And we can simply say, okay, I'd like the values, the position values of all these earthquakes from this table. And I'd like to see a list plot, a geo-list plot of all of these points. And so here's where all of these earthquakes were recorded from 2000 to 2023. And so you might be interested in thinking, well, you know, where were earthquakes most densely recorded? And so you can just do the same thing with a geosmooth histogram. And here we get a very clear, I think this is called in French, this is called la ceinture de feu, the fire belt. But we can see that there's this strong activity in Southeast Asia of earthquakes. And if we look at the frequency distribution of earthquake magnitudes, we can see also that this follows a power law. So this is a power law with the A and K parameters echoed here of 2.48 approximately and minus 12.35. And you can see that these recorded earthquakes will follow largely this power law distribution in this log plot. Another way that you might want to study real world data from the geosphere is using remote sensing. And remote sensing includes a number of different techniques to bring in real world geographic products. For instance, remote sensing covers things like aircraft and satellite imagery, or LiDAR, or radar data, and various derivatives of these data. And there are many state organizations and international organizations that provide um, remote sensing services for free, and you just have to sort of be able to collect that data and bring it in. So in the Wolfram language, we have remote sensing tools that allow you to bring in and visualize remote sensing data. For instance, here is Landsat vegetation greenness for the year 2000, and here is mass concentration of chlorophyll in seawater on the 1st of January of this year. And this is from NASA's Gibbs service, and this is from Copernicus EU's Marine Data Service. And we can simply bring, in the case of the Gibbs data, for example, we can simply just say, I'd like to get a geographics object with the geoserver specified to this particular resource at this particular date, bring it in, plot it for me, and it will give it to you. Complex systems also extend beyond natural systems. I think that's maybe a little bit uncautious of me to say, because the humans and human societies are part of nature. Um, but but the point is, complex systems extend to human systems, anthropogenic systems, um, like language, human societies, and other things. In the case of languages, for example, you have meaning that is an emergent phenomena, that meaning emerges from the assemblages of words constrained by grammars. And the use of living languages constantly produces new and diffuses new meanings within the speaking population. Also, the diffusion of these new meanings contributes to the evolution of the languages through time. So there's this feedback system that is changing and evolving the language. That's built into the system and the way that it runs. We find power law distributions also in these complex anthropogenic systems. For instance, the rank order distribution of words, the rank order distribution of words by frequency is famously also a power law. This is called the Zipf distribution. So this, for example, if we take the frequency of words in the origin of species, we see that the most frequent word is about twice as likely as the second most frequent word, and 3 times as likely as the third, etc., etc. And this follows a power law. Social systems are also complex systems typically, and they're comprised of many agents. They're comprised of different modules, which can be the people, groups, institutions. And within these systems, you have the emergence of patterns of recirculation of resources, and that those resources could be material resources, that could be information, and these recirculation patterns emerge from the interactions of system agents, and those form things like cultural norms, economies, and cities, and other anthropogenic phenomena. So here, for example, is just for illustration, a small network of friends. Um, And so, as in languages, we find power laws in complex social systems and in the distribution of phenomena that are the result of complex social systems. For example, in the ways that companies scale, we can see that if we take the rank order distribution of companies by total number of employees, this is in the United. Actually, no, this is not in the United States. This is worldwide, I think. Then the companies by total employees in this distribution roughly follow a power law. So I think this is all remarkable, and definitely information to take some time to digest. But I want to observe that we haven't really defined what complex systems are yet. So I want to spend a little bit of time fleshing out these definitions and clarifying what we mean when we say something is a complex system, and what we mean when we say something is emergent, for example. So complex systems are networks of typically non-linearly interacting components. They're dynamic, and they're typically far from equilibrium. And as we've said, the local component interactions result in spontaneous self-organization, such that the systems are never completely random or completely regular, and this results in macroscopic emergent behavior. We can say that interactions between components are strong enough that they can't be treated as non-interacting. And typically this is a principle that will apply in modeling as well. You wouldn't include a component in your complex system model unless it's interacting with other components. It just doesn't make sense to. And one consequence of all of this is that complex systems never really behave randomly or completely chaotically. They're always somewhere in between these states. We can say that a subset of complex systems are also adaptive. So complex systems that are adaptive are systems in which the rules that govern the system aren't they aren't fixed. And this is a distinction we make between what are called complex physical systems, where the components are fixed, they interact according to fixed rules, or rules that change predictably based on a fixed like meta rule, and the the components the component states change through time, but the components themselves are sort of bounded and defined, predefined, and they stay the same. Whereas in a complex adaptive system, agents are not fixed, and the rules according to which they interact aren't fixed either. So when you're having a conversation, for example, um, as a person, you're evolving, you're changing, you're growing through that conversation. So the way that you're interacting is changing as a result of that ongoing conversation. And that's a very simple example uh, of the way that components in adaptive systems will evolve as the systems do. I'm going to skip the definition of complexity for the moment, just because I think I want to be mindful of the time that we have. Um, so self-organization. What do we mean by self-organization? Self-organization is a dynamical process by which a system acquires and maintains macroscopic structures and behaviors without external control. And we can, as a rule of thumb, self-organization is always going to increase uh, is always going to increase the order of a system's behavior. So, for example, you can consider a heated pan of water, and once the water starts boiling, it shifts from conduction, where the heat diffuses through the water without causing it to move, to cellular convection, where the differences in density between the water at the top and the bottom of the pan causes it to flow and form these cells, these convection cells. So you have um, some some external some external input of energy, for example, and it results in this this self-organization of the system that results in a phase change. Emergence is a bit more complicated and a little fuzzier to define. And the reason that it's a little fuzzier to define is because in some sense, it's very fundamentally subjective in the way that we would want to define it. A system is said to exhibit emergence when coherent properties, behaviors, structures, and patterns, which we call emergents, dynamically arise at the macroscopic scale from the interactions between its components at the microscopic scale. And these emergents are new with regard to the system components. So we have to back up a little bit and define a few other things. What does coherence mean? Coherence means that uh, coherence refers to the interdependence of sets of constraints that enable the persistence of a system's organizational structures through time by preserving system boundary conditions. So coherence is connections between the um, the system components that constrain and preserve the boundary conditions. And there are formal mathematical definitions of this. Uh, it's also referred to as organizational closure, and this is a term that biologists might be more familiar with. However we define emergence, it's always going to be inherently subjective, because emergence fundamentally depends on our ability to recognize and describe patterns. So when we say something is emergent, what we're really saying a lot of the time is we've found something surprising, and that we can't it results from the interactions between components at a local scale, and we can't explain them simply by just the addition of these interactions. So emergence means that there's gestalt involved. And there are all sorts of ontological, epistemological questions about human perception, which this relates to, which are far beyond the scope of this particular presentation. But I think it's important to realize that there's a fuzziness that's inherent to the way that we define emergence presently. And to clarify this fuzziness, one of the ways that one of the proposed approaches has been to distinguish between what's called strong and weak emergence. Um, Scholars debate the criteria for what we might consider something to be truly emergent, when we might consider something to be truly emergent. And in the case where they're ontologically new with regards to the system components, we call that strong emergence. And in the case where they're only epistemologically new, we consider that weak emergence. So another way of putting this is that strong emergence results in phenomena that have causal effects that are causally potent in the real world, whereas weak emergence is just a property of the system that appears as a result of the system organization. And you can see how the differences between these things can get blurry themselves. So, for example, in this picture in black and white, if you focus a little bit on it, you can probably pick out that this is a picture of a Dalmatian. And so in a sense, we can say that the Dalmatian emerges from this pattern of blots and points. And this is probably weak emergence. And I think it's probably fairly uncontroversial that this is weak emergence. This is the emergence of the Dalmatian is, if it's causally potent, it's very weakly causally potent. But then we might look at Earth systems, and in which, Earth systems enable the emergence of life, in the emergence of things like trees, which have direct causal consequences on the environment, such as providing ecosystem niches. And so this is a distinction that's been proposed. This is the core of the distinction that's proposed uh, between strong and weak emergence. So I'd like to ask you now, in the another poll question, I'd like to ask you, in your opinion, what kind of emergence is wetness an example of? And I would like to clarify also that this is these last polls don't have necessarily uh, right or wrong answers. I think these are things that are rightfully debated, and I think the definitions of strong and weak emergence and emergence itself are also subject to debate. We have a slight preference, it seems, for weak emergence, although I think it's fairly split evenly almost between the three answers. And there are a few there's somewhat fewer of us saying that wetness is not an example of emergence. I I think I would characterize wetness as an example uh, of weak emergence. What I mean, there's a what does wetness do in the world that is like what's the I don't know. It's one of those things, right, where it gets complicated to really define what you're to be clear in your definition of terms. Oops. Okay, and I'm going to ask you one more of these. Um, what kind of emergence is consciousness an example of? We have a couple people saying consciousness is not an example of emergence. That's interesting. And the majority of people are leaning towards either there is no consensus on how to answer this question, or it's an example of strong emergence. And I think that's probably fair. I think both of those answers are probably appropriate. I think, but I think I'm leaning personally towards the I would lean personally towards consciousness being an example of strong emergence, but again, it gets complicated to define exactly how you distinguish between those. Okay. I'm going to skip the section on self-organization in relation to one another and emergence in relation to one another. I just want to say that you can have self-organization without emergence. You can have emergence without self-organization. And you can also have self-organization with emergence. And typically when you have both of them, that's characteristic of what you see in complex systems. So to close this presentation, I'm just going to end on an example of emergent behavior from cellular automata. So our own internal definition at Wolfram is a cellular automaton is a collection of colored cells on a grid of a specified shape that evolves through a number of discrete time steps according to a set of rules based on the state of neighboring cells. And for instance, one-dimensional cellular automata are cellular automata on one-dimensional arrays. So in these models, at each step, the cell updates based on its previous state and the state of its immediate neighboring cells according to the mapping defined below. So, for example, here's one example of a particular rule set. You would have if this middle cell, if you have a cell that has two black neighbors and two filled neighbors and is filled itself, and then at the next state it's going to be unfilled. And you might call these alive and dead. And so this is how you would read it, is you would say, this is the previous state, this is the subject cell, this is the state of the subject cell at the next time step. And so if you apply this rule in sequence, you get this evolution where starting with this initial condition, the cells will separate and then they'll separate again, they'll sort of drift apart. The rules, the convention for naming of one-dimensional cellular automata rules is according to a scheme proposed by Stephen Wolfram in 1983, and this has still since become the standard notation. And you can find a rules number by reading the bottom row of a rule plot as a binary number and converting that to base 10. So here are a few examples of some nice rules that result in some interesting emergent structures, based on, in each case, based on a row of zeros with one in the center. And we're reading this downwards. The evolution through time is flowing downwards in these plots. And this is for, I don't know how many steps. This is for 100 steps, I believe. Yeah. And so this concludes the lecture part of this presentation. So I think we can open up for some questions. I'm going to look into in the Q&A really quickly and see if there are some questions that I can answer. Yes, okay. So someone asks, I say avalanches don't display self-organized criticality. However, the sandpile example appears to counter this. So this is a good question. The answer is that real-world avalanches behave quite differently from the avalanches in the sandpile model. And basically, and in fact, the sandpile model behaves very differently from avalanches in sand. It's much closer. There's a study that showed that if you reproduce you find this you find these scale invariant avalanche distributions in if you were to take a pile of grains of rice, for example, and you kept dropping new grains of rice on the top, then you find this power law distribution of avalanche sizes. But if you do it with sand, you don't get that same distribution. And the fact is that in nature you have this accumulation of when you look at snow avalanches, you have this accumulation of snow up to I don't have a very clear answer, but there's a paper exploring specifically whether the question of whether snow avalanches have display self-organized criticality, and the fact is that snow avalanche scale distributions don't follow power laws, so it's sort of it's fairly clear that they can't result from self-organized criticality. Right. Somebody asks define emergence and wetness. So, well, if you suppose you take I would say, okay, in my view, I think wetness is sort of like a perceptual property of water, or of liquids. If you take a molecule or a small amount of molecules of water together, the example is often given, well, when does that collection become wet? It becomes wet at some point when there's enough of it for you to feel its wetness and to describe it as wetness. Or you might say that wetness is a more you could define wetness in a physical sense, in which case I'm not sure exactly how you would define it. But but there's a transition where at some point that you have enough stuff there that you would describe this liquid, you would describe this blob of something as wet. And so in that sense, you could say that wetness is an emergent property of liquids, of the assemblage of these molecules. We have a question: do these models fall under the form of agent-based models? We don't have typical agents here, but the results look a lot like what we might see in NetLogo, for example. Yes. So I think so. In complex adaptive systems, you would typically call the components of those systems agents, and in complex physical systems, this is just convention. But in complex physical systems, I'm sorry, I'm just seeing other questions go in. In complex physical systems, the components conventionally aren't necessarily called agents. I think typically agent-based models are models where the agents are modeled individually. I'm not sure that um, that's necessarily always the case, but you can and also I would say that a lot of models that you can program models in many different ways in a lot of cases. So you might be able to define an agent-based model version of the forest fire model, um, just as you might define a version where it's not so clear that the behavior of agents is being computed individually, but you might be able to reproduce the same behavior overall. So somebody reiterates the question: what is the definition of a complex system? I think the summary, the big takeaway from this presentation, I think, is that a complex system is a system in which it's a system that displays emergent behavior at the at the global scale as a result of interactions between of local scale interactions. So that's the broadest sense in which we can understand complex systems. And then what is complexity? Complexity, this is why I sort of skipped it, but complexity is just the behavior, the emergent behavior that we see from complex systems. So it's fuzzy in the same way that emergence is.
All right, Phileas, thank you for your presentation. I guess there is another question from Irene. She's asking, are living system complex adaptive systems?
As far as I am aware, I would say, I mean, yeah, all living systems that we know of, I would say complex adapt. I'd say living systems, according to our modern understanding of life, are all complex adaptive systems. And in fact, life more broadly is a sort of complex adaptive process where you have, if you evolution as a process is a fundamentally adaptive process that results in emergent phenomena. The emergence in that case being the new species and the adaptations of the species to their environmental changes and to their evolving conditions and to one another. So yes, I would say that living systems in general are complex adaptive systems.
Well, perfect. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really informative.